Hey everyone, welcome to CoLab Conversations, the podcast dedicated to sparking dialogue and meaningful conversations about the invaluable role of patient advocacy. I'm your host, Sabrina Hanna, and I'm thrilled that you're here. And I'm thrilled that you're here, Barry Stein. Barry is the president and CEO of Colorectal Cancer Canada and has been a driving force for positive change in the colorectal cancer community for over 20 years. His unwavering commitment to improving treatment access for all cancer patients in Canada, particularly by actively involving patients in clinical trials, has had a profound impact. Barry's advocacy extends to promoting primary prevention measures and championing population-based colorectal cancer screening. His tireless efforts and commitment to these critical aspects of cancer care have not gone unnoticed. Barry has been honored with awards that recognize his exceptional contributions to the field. His passion for ensuring patients have access to cancer clinical trials reflects his deep dedication, and his leadership continues to make a significant difference in the lives of individuals impacted by cancer. Hi, Barry. Thank you for
Hi,
being here.
it's a pleasure to be here and thanks for having me.
So normally I'll ask my guests to give me a little background information on how they got started in patient advocacy, but today I feel like I really just want to jump into the topic with you, just because there's so much to discuss. So I want to start with the charter, the Canadian Cancer Clinical Trials Stakeholder Charter. And I mean, because you were there, I was involved in that, and I have a lot of pride in that document. So maybe just start by telling us how it came about and what it is and how it came about.
So sure, one of the sort of driving forces for it was actually a CPAC, a Canadian Partnership Against Cancer, report that showed that participation in clinical trials in Canada was between 2 to 7%. So really a very low number of Canadians are participating and benefiting from clinical trials. And of course, we do know that those who do participate in clinical trials actually have access to some of the newest innovations, which ultimately will be launched hopefully in Canada. And it's something that we want to encourage, both the participation in the trials and to have more trials available for Canadian cancer patients. So when we saw that report, and that goes back to pre-COVID times, a number of us met together with our scientific advisory committee, yourself, as you know, Sabrina, other patient groups, oncologists, clinical trial networks, researchers from across the country, and research networks from across the country, and try to see, what model could we follow that might help to ameliorate the situation and increase not only the amount of clinical trials in Canada, but participation in them. And we quickly realized that one of the ways that some of the in both industry and academic trials were doing it was to certainly include the patients in terms of patient perspectives, but they hadn't really included the patient groups who had that, what I call institutional memory and ability to not only to help ideate clinical trials, develop better protocols together, perhaps pick up PROMs, PREMs, and patient preferences throughout the trials, and bring that information back to health technology assessment bodies in Canada, meaning CADTH and INESS. And we also felt that the patient groups could help publicize these trials among their respective patients and family members connected with their patient groups, and increase the recruitment and support those patients throughout the clinical trial as well. So that's how we began. And then we said, well, what model can we create or can we emulate from around the world? And we started to look at different models and landed at the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative out of Duke University that partnered with the FDA. And we saw that similarly, they were looking at how to work together with patients and patient groups and increase patient centricity and participation in clinical trials. And we saw who was involved in that. All the major pharma companies, academia was involved, the FDA was involved. And we said, well, we don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel, but we do have to Canadianize the model because we recognize there are differences in Canada from the United States and other countries. And with that, we sat down together with a group, as I said, that included yourself and others, and looked at the trajectory from the preclinical to the phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trial stages, to the Health Canada review and approval process, and then the post-approval studies and outcomes. And then even beyond that, which is not actually part of the model, but we started to think, as real-world evidence platforms were developing in Canada, how can we take that information in a pre-notice of compliance, pre-NOC period by Health Canada, and how we could feed that back into the later stages of health technology assessment, as I said, at CADTH and INESS. And that's how it began.
Yeah. And so you talked about the city model, and we call it here the C city model, the Canadian version of the city model. Do you feel like there has been willingness to adopt this model in the Canadian landscape?
So there's definitely a willingness to participate in it. And in fact, one of the things that I do is particularly on the academic side, we have, whenever we're asked for a letter of support on a CIHR grant, we furnish the model, and we'll talk about the charter after, and indicate that it's not just about checking the box for patient participation or patient group participation on a letter of support. It's about true, not involvement, but engagement in the clinical trial process. And by engagement, I mean true collaboration between the trial sponsor, researcher, and the patient group, and of course, a patient representative. So not necessarily the participant in the trial, but the patient advisor and patient group advisor to the trial, who will work with the trial sponsor and researcher throughout that period in true engagement. We also have shown the model to industry, not just in Canada, but globally, and there's great interest in it. And in fact, everybody who sees the model says, yes, this is what we should be doing. And what they should be doing is not necessarily what they are doing, but it is definitely what they would like to do more and more. And there are different slants on that, so to speak. They have different perceptions and capabilities within the companies. And sometimes it means getting the patient centricity people within a company to work together with the clinical trials people more closely, and in fact even merge those groups together in this process so that we can have true engagement, as I said, and get the benefits. And we know from the work done in the United States that not only can it save a lot of money by doing this, but it can also ensure that the trial is set out in a proper way, the protocol is set out in a proper way, that patients will adhere to the clinical trial and remain in the clinical trial. There is a less dropout, and actually they've been able to put a dollar figure on it to show that it is very cost effective and actually saves the trial sponsor money as they go through it. But of course, from the patient perspective, what we want to assure is that it is a trial that benefits patients, that it is a patient-centered trial, and that we can better understand both the PROMs, the PREMs, and the patient preferences throughout the trial, so that we can, not in 30 or 40 days prior to submission at CADTH or INESS, have to scramble to get patients' input, but we can truly understand through our engagement the patient's perspectives on a particular drug, or it could be a device, of course, or some sort of treatment. But we often think of it primarily from a drug point of view.
So are there companies who are adopting the Canadian city model here in Canada, or in other regions that you've talked about? And if they are, great. And if they're not, why not?
So in the companies that I've spoken to globally, because very often these trials are done globally, they agree with the model and appear to say that they are doing this type of engagement with patient groups and so forth, but they haven't formally adopted the model. And we're at that stage right now. We're speaking to companies globally where they will formally, hopefully, adopt the model, and not just the process, but they definitely are beginning to look at this process and see how they could adapt it. Some companies are looking at from the point of view of how they can pick up patient experience data from it without formally adopting it. But I think that those who who are committed to doing true engagement, as I said, as opposed to involvement, are looking at developing it. And I've participated in some of the preclinical discussions and interviews on behalf of Colorectal Cancer Canada with some global partners, so the major pharmaceutical companies. But there's a disconnect in sometimes how they gather that preclinical information and the commencement of the actual development of the protocol and the trial itself. So that is a gap that we've identified, because very often they outsource the gathering of that information and then go back internally and start developing the protocol without thinking to bring back the patient partner and a patient association into that process. And then the next time you hear from them is, hey, we're recruiting, for this trial. Can you help us? So that is a gap that we've identified. And so to specifically answer your question, they're starting to think about adapting the model, but we don't have any. They're almost afraid, as I would say, to formally adopt the model, because then they have to go through a whole process. But they're definitely following on the pattern of the model.
And so just to go back to the charter for a second, when we think about the charter, and maybe you could just talk a little bit about the 5 tenets in the charter, do those help address the low accrual in the clinical trials in Canada?
I think so. I think the part that would address the participation in the trials is really the greater collaboration between the pharma company or academic trial sponsor and the patient groups. Excuse me. More so than the tenets of the charter, and we'll come back to that in a second. I think the tenets of the charter not only enrich the trial, but help to ensure the the right elements are being approached throughout the trial, and help to support the outputs from the trial. So it's a little bit of a different perspective, but I think, from the point of view of just increasing participation, it is that connection with the patient groups early on in order to help in the recruitment to make it a successful trial, or a more successful trial. I think that's where the tenets start to come into play.
So, and talking about that patient partnership within the clinical trials, and I think we know that we're talking about like from the get-go, so the co-creation of the trials. Maybe we can switch into PACT, which is the patient-centric approach to clinical trials, and I don't know if we call that a coalition or a group, but let's talk a little bit about PACT and how does that contribute to the evolution of clinical trials so that it looks like something that is more patient-centric.
Sure. So the PACT group or steering committee at this point helps to also, it works throughout the year, first of all, and helps to define our annual clinical trials conference, which is not specific to colorectal. It's really a broad, all cancer trials. In fact, we look globally in every area in order to see, what we can enhance in this process. This year, we looked at embedding clinical research into clinical practice, for example. So really broader types of concepts into it. But the PACT group, which consists of different groups and who are involved in clinical trials or clinical trial networks, and some who actually conduct clinical trials themselves, in addition to the patient groups, look at really from a more holistic point of view. How can we make it a better trial, and how can we, of course, the recruitment, but at the end of the day, how can we make it a better trial? And the group works together on really from the focus, because PACT stands for patient-centered approach to clinical trials, really on patient centricity from every aspect of it. And that's what led to the development of the charter, in fact, in order to better determine not only the engagement between the trial sponsor and the patient group, but how to implement patient centricity and engagement throughout the clinical trials and operationalize, if you will, the model that I referred to from the preclinical, the different phases of the trial, the Health Canada review and approval, and the post-approval studies and outcomes. So from there, we developed among this group 5 tenets. The first of which is making patient centricity a norm in clinical trials. The second tenet is supporting education, training, and development of patient group members. The third is collaborating with patient groups as equal and independent parties. I mean, that in itself is quite something. How to participate as equal or independent partners. This is not something that trial sponsors are used to hearing. Adhering to transparency and accountability. This is really something that's really, really important. The need to be transparent and to account for the results, whatever they may be throughout the trial. They are also looking, as our fifth tenet, the trial sponsor will be looking at how to maximize the potential and collect and utilize real-world evidence or real-world data that's captured not in the clinical trial, but just after the clinical trial. So how can we maximize the use of real-world evidence? And those of you who've been working in this area hear this every day. We talk about real-world evidence or real-world data, but how do we actually capture that data is the challenge, right? Post-trial, how do we follow up with the trial participants? And that goes to how do we do the consent in the first place for the trial, and how we can follow up with those patients and support them along the way. Because remember, in cancer trials in particular, a lot of the patients are using this as part of their treatment in a sense, but also usually after they've had or exhausted other lines of treatment. It shouldn't be that way. It should be seen as perhaps in some cases a first line of approach, and I could give some great examples of that. Window of opportunity trials, for example, and some new ones actually in colorectal cancer for neoadjuvant treatment with earlier stage patients. So really quite exciting. But how do we collect that real world data is a challenge, and something that we look at with some of our partners in the Canadian Personalized Healthcare Innovation Network, or through Exactus Innovation, some of the work that we do in that area to collect data. And certainly something that Kadith and Ines have not totally figured out yet, but they're working on it.
I'm going to jump around a little bit because you said a lot of things that I want to ask you about, but you just talked about clinical trials as standard of, it should be like a standard of care. So do you think that there is a need to normalize clinical trials as standard of care?
So really, this is the short answer is yes. And it is as a result of some amazing work that has been going on in terms of comprehensive genomic profiling. So as we see that we're able to identify smaller and smaller groups of patients who have specific mutations and match those patients with very precision medicines that target those mutations, we know that we have to start thinking about clinical trials in a different way, because we will never have phase 3 trials for these small groups of patients around the world. And we will have a lot of trouble both finding the patients if we're not normalizing and increasing access to, I guess you can call it biomarker testing or comprehensive genomic profiling of the patient. So we have to figure out ways to take these trials, which will likely only go to phase 2 trials, and collect the real world data over longer periods of time, maybe even by utilizing things like patient support programs or other ways of collecting data by creating real world evidence frameworks.
So I'm really impressed that you were able to remember the 5 tenets off the top of your head, because I wrote 2 of them and I couldn't tell you which one's the first one and the last one. I know I wrote those 2, but just to
I'll
go
go
back
through
to
them.
just to go back to those, would you use those tenets to define if a clinical trial is actually patient-centric? Or how do you define if a trial is patient-centric?
I mean, that's a good question. I think that really depends on the case and, and the particular trial. But certainly, if you think of the clinical trial as a continuum, starting with how you ideate the trial, what is the trial going to be about? What are the endpoints that are important, not only from a drug approval point of view, but from a patient-centered point of view? And you start to ideate a trial like that and then build the protocol around what's important to patients. Obviously, there are certain things from a regulatory point of view that have to go into the trial as well if the drug is ultimately going to be submitted to Health Canada for an NOC or a conditional NOC. So those things have to be taken into account, needless to say. But if you start with the patient in the first place, or the patient group, or both together, to ideate the trial, develop the protocol, and look at how to recruit patients together, maybe by creating communities of practice, and then work through the trial continuum to collect not only the patient-reported outcomes, but the PREMs, as well as the patient preferences throughout the trial. For example, maybe, and just to take a very easy one, maybe you're making a pill that's way too large and the patient doesn't want to take that pill, or maybe they prefer IV over an oral therapy, or vice versa. I mean, these are simple ones, but just to exemplify the point, there's a patient preference either in IV or oral therapy, or the type of oral therapy that they may receive. Very simple ones. Or maybe the trial requires the patient to report too often and they're not feeling well. Can this be done more remotely? Can in fact much of the trial be embedded in clinical practice in order to avoid having to come down to the cancer center? And maybe you can increase have a more equitable and diverse and inclusive type of trial by embedding this type of research in with clinicians throughout the province or country. So many different types of ways that can impact the trial. Needless to say, there are different types of trials, such as adaptive trials and so forth, that can be improved through the use of the patient and patient group engagement throughout the process. So patient centricity is really in the DNA of the trial, and post-trial as well, in order to really reflect what's important to patients and truly engage with them and have outputs that at the end of the day meet the needs of patients. And that's why the very first tenet of the charter is to make patient centricity a norm within clinical trials.
Yeah, so I think for me, the reason why I really appreciate this project is because I can see how this patient-centric approach can transform the clinical trial landscape and lead to more successful outcomes in the clinical trials. And whether that means there are more reimbursements or more regulatory approvals, whatever the case may be. I really believe that this approach can transform the clinical trial landscape. How do you see it?
Well, I think, a lot of companies actually say, oh, we're patient-centered. And as I say, their patient centricity team works independently from the clinical trials team. So, there is that need to sort of think of it in a more holistic fashion. But not every patient group is going to be able to do this, and you're not going to be able to do this in every single trial as well. So one of the second tenet actually of the charter is to support the education and training and development of these patient group members. It's not a natural instinct for patient groups to be able to do this type of work, nor is it natural for the researchers and trial sponsors to work together with the patient group. They themselves have to be trained to work together. So really, there's the second tenet really is about supporting the education, the training, and the development of the patient group, but really everybody to work together in this process to support a successful trial.
And so when you talk about engaging the patients, like what does that actually look like?
Well, we start with the patient groups, right, who could have a representative advisor in some cases, so that the patient group basically supports the patient advisor in the clinical trial. And the patient advisor not only works with the trial sponsor or the researcher throughout the trial, but connects very often with the patients within the trial, the subjects of the trial, to work together to support them. So it's really a real team that's working together, the patient group representative, the trial sponsor, of course, but more directly, the researcher who works together to ensure that we obviously recruit patients for the trial, that we support them so that they stay and within the trial, hopefully, and that they do well within the trial, and we better understand their needs and means throughout the trial, and of course, their side effects and so forth. And then engage with them even post-trial in order to better inform everybody, including the people in HTA, in health technology assessment, as to why, if it is a successful trial and a drug that meets the needs of patients, it should be reimbursed.
Yeah. And just to go back to the example that you gave about the pill being too large, I feel like something as simple as that could really affect the success of the trial. So, like having that discussion with the patients before you're actually, doing the design, like that could have a huge impact on the outcome.
Well, I could tell you sometimes, the end result is this very large pill. And then when it comes to market, so to speak, and the patient gets the pill, what does adherence look like? Will they take the pill? Even if they make it through the trial because, the regime of being into it in a trial, and maybe the intensity of working together with the researcher, and you take the treatment, but what happens even post trial? Will there be adherence to that? So I could tell you in my own instance, when I was going through cancer treatment, and as you know, I had metastatic colon cancer, and one of the treatments that I did at the time was an oral therapy, and I took it as adjuvant treatment, meaning post-surgery, in order to prevent the recurrence of the disease coming back. I took these pills for 1 week, and I just couldn't take it any longer because I couldn't swallow such a large pill, and I just gave up on it. So I did not adhere to it. Fortunately, everything worked out okay, but that just goes to show you this is a product that went through all the phases of the trial, was approved and marketed, and then when it came to adherence and taking the product, I didn't adhere to it. So I'm a good example.
Yeah, it is
Perhaps
a
that
really
should have
good
been
example.
discussed before during the trial.
You also talked about what the one of the tenets, and I think it's the fourth one on the transparency. And I don't remember it's transparency and accountability. And I know you do, but so I know that when we were drafting that, we talked a lot about communicating with the patients throughout the clinical trial. So not like they come into the clinical trial, they sign this like long document of consent, which a lot of the time is very difficult to understand, but that there's this communication throughout the whole process. And then at the end, like you actually know what your involvement in the clinical trial, like what was your like what was the end result, what happened, and that's not happening now.
Well, I would say the most important part of that is to know, what is what is the result of the trial? What are they finding out that the patients may not necessarily know who are participating in the trial? And so, for example, if the trial is not working out, what are the results of the trial? Or if it is working out, what are the results of the trial? What is the effectiveness of the particular drug that's being tested in the trial? How are the research questions, being answered? So it really means about mutual transparency and open communication with the patient and patient groups, all throughout the clinical trial continuum, as you will. So there's many things that you can take from that. Apart from the developing the trust and the confidence between the parties, it also forces the sponsor to hold themselves, to the greatest levels of accountability, because obviously it's a trial, and you have to ensure that that the results are and the consequences of the trial are known by the patient, and the things that they follow up with the patient and the patient group to ensure not only the safety and efficacy of the product, but also the long-term benefit or side effects with the patient. But it really means sharing the individual results with the patient at the end, or the patient group, and knowing that trust is developing as a consequence of that willingness to take it on seriously as one of the key tenets of participating in a clinical trial.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, building that trust. But then there's also that communication, whether the trial is successful or not. And why isn't that happening now?
I think it is happening more and more. I think it is a principle that a lot of the companies do feel strongly about. I think there were many examples in the past where that didn't happen, but I think that more and more in these global trials, they are trying to, at least within a period post-trial, better inform the participants in the trial as to the results, throughout the process and post trial. So they are, I think companies more and more are starting to engage in that regard. Maybe it's not as formalized as we have in our 5 tenets in the trial, but I think that they do see this as something very important for the patient, and from their own perspective of developing trust in trials. And of course, by developing trust, then you encourage other, if they're a trustworthy partner, then patients will be more willing to participate in trials as well. And that it sort of, goes full circle. If you want to be seen as a trustworthy partner, where patients will want to be participating in the trial and encourage participation in the trial, this is an essential element in order to develop that trust.
Uh, you brought up the embedding clinical trials in clinical practice. And for me, this was a concept that I learned at the conference in November. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, I mean, this is really quite interesting in the sense that really COVID, brought this about, and the recovery trial that was done for the COVID vaccines. So what it really means is, how can we do trials faster? How can we do them, get those results more effectively, run different arms, adapt the trials accordingly, and get this much more broadly spread out? So we do talk about a couple of things. We talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and we talk about decentralized trials. So there's different models that can be looked at in terms of different centers. Sort of think of it as spokes of a wheel, and this would be aligned with something that 3CTN, for example, has developed in their CRAFT model. But if you think of it even more diversely and think about in all clinicians, being able to participate in this trial much more broadly, so not just separate sites that are around a province or a country, but really in every clinician's practice, you could really, really recruit a lot more people, be have much more equity and diversity and inclusion, and make those trials work actually faster because you're having much greater participation in it. So that's what it kind of meant, and it was sort of based on the type of work that they did in the UK throughout their vaccine trials, and some of the work that's been going on. For example, John Marshall at St. Mike's participates in a lung cancer trial, the REMAP PAP trial, and again, it's an adaptive trial and really looking at how to embed the research into the clinicians throughout the country and worldwide. So those are some of the benefits that can be garnered from spreading out the research like that. And of course, we were talking before about precision medicines. So how do you find, if you don't do this, how do you find larger groups of patients who have very specific mutations that can be addressed by some of these precision medicines? That's another reason for looking more broadly and embedding these clinical research trials into clinical practice. So lot to be benefit. I'm certainly not an expert in the area. I think everybody is learning how to do this as we go along, and that COVID really helped to accelerate those types of new trials. And again, this has to go through Health Canada, right? This has to meet the regulatory approach to doing clinical trials, and so that ultimately, when there is a result, that they will get a NOC or NOCC, and the drug will be approved in Canada. So really, really requires some thinking, and we need to think about it from the perspective of precision medicines and the ability to be more inclusive in our trials.
If I'm not mistaken, I believe the conference was recorded. Is it available at Colorectal Cancer Canada? Like if we go on the website, can we?
I don't have the link right now, but it's going. It is coming up on colorectalcancercanada.com in our clinical trial section, and it will also be on pactcanada.org, which is the patient-centered approach to clinical trials site as well. So that's PACT.org, Canada.org, as well as colorectalcancercanada.com.
And so can we talk a little bit about the patient-centric approach to clinical trials conference? I know it just happened in November. You probably don't have dates for the next one, but let's talk a little bit about the conference. I was there. It was such a great conference. And I encourage everybody who is listening now, if you have the time, go back, listen to the previous one, but really register to be present at the next one. And I'll let you talk a little bit more about it.
Well, sure. I mean, as I mentioned before, the concept of the conference is to engage with trial sponsors and researchers on various topics, and to ensure that we have a patient-centered approach, but we look at different aspects of it. Of the whole ecosystem. So they do vary very often in terms of topics that we would cover in the actual outline for it. But we do work, as I said, throughout the year through PAC to try to identify some of these new things that can help to improve clinical trials and try to highlight what's going on around the world in this area. So this year, what we did was we as we mentioned, looked at how to embed clinical research into clinical trials, and we brought people not only from Canada but from around the world. But we have in the past looked at different parts of the process. For example, I'll just not talk about this year first of all, but some previous years, which were really quite exciting. We brought in the head of the person that held the moonshot in the U.S., the cancer moonshot, in order to tell us how we could accelerate access to new cancer treatments and the research in that area. We brought in a person who heads up Project Orbis, which is how to get faster access to some of these new drugs in Canada through health access. And we brought in the person that heads up really a lot of the work that's being done in decentralized trials and equity, diversity, and inclusion throughout the United States. As well as the people from clinicaltrials.gov to help to navigate trials better. And then we blend them in with our Canadian counterparts, whether it's from the clinical trial networks or the researchers or Health Canada or CADTH, who of course, or INES, who have participated in these conferences as well, always to try to inspire what's going on in Canada through the developments that happen globally. And this year, that's exactly what we did. We brought in people from the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative at Duke University and looked at some of the new approaches that they're doing there, as well as I mentioned before, from the National Health Institute in the UK, on how they actually inspired the clinical trials for the recovery trial that impacted all of us, and to see how can we do that and what is going on around the world similarly in order to accelerate access in clinical trials and accelerate the results from these clinical trials by having this embedding of the research in clinical practice. But we also looked at the processes in Canada that are going on. For example, bringing in CADTH and saying, what is important or what is in the pipeline from all the manufacturers. We've done panels with the manufacturers to see, what's coming down the pipeline. How can we better prepare for this in Canada? What is the collaboration between health technology assessment bodies worldwide? And how can we utilize that information in order to accelerate access and to improve what we do here? So we talked about managed entry agreements maybe 3-4 years ago because we foresaw that precision medicines was going to have a profound impact not only on the way we do clinical trials in Canada, but how patients would gain access to them and the need for molecular profiling throughout the country. So many of the projects that we've accelerated at Colorectal Cancer Canada have been inspired by this work, and we know that the other patient groups who come to this meeting, their work has also been inspired by this, and that's why we welcome all patient groups throughout the country to participate in these in this program at the Clinical Trial Conference, and even if they're interested in joining PACT, of course, and getting more engaged in this process, because we know through our own experience at Colorectal Cancer Canada that it impacts our programming and ultimately helps our patients. And I think the same can be said for other groups that have participated in the process and in PACT as well.
I have a few more questions, but since you brought it up, if there is a patient group who's listening, or a patient who is involved with the patient group who is listening and thinks that they would benefit or can contribute to PACT, how would they do that?
Well, they could call you, or they could call us directly, and we will put our program manager on it, who's working on it, because we've dedicated a project manager to work on PACT as well, and of course, it's a very engaging group that works together in PACT, very collaborative group, who come from various backgrounds, and it's really a safe space in order to discuss these opportunities to, at the end of the day, improve access to clinical trials and make better trials for all of our patients. And one of the things that we know that we need to do, and we hope to encourage, is through this work, demonstrating that we have a community in Canada that's really engaging and willing to work with trial sponsors, academic and industry, and patient groups and researchers in order to encourage more clinical trials and better clinical trials in Canada.
So, you and I discussed this when we were at the airport when our flight was delayed. Um, I left that conference feeling really overwhelmed with the lack of movement, or I mean, I don't really know what the right word is, but there's just so much that needs to be overcome, and clinical trials is like just one aspect of the cancer continuum in Canada. So how do we start to tackle some of these barriers?
So I view it as and it's easy, of course, to get overwhelmed because there is so much to be done. But I view it as starting again with the patient and thinking about what we as patients go through. And I personally had to get certain clinical trials started for myself when I really had no experience in the area at all, and participate in them both in Canada and outside of Canada, to better understand. And I have to say that, generally speaking, in the past, those trials that I participated in, I was hardly involved. I was a subject of the trial, but not involved at all in the trial or engaged in the trial from a clinical trial development perspective. I was just a subject in those trials and really did not receive a lot of information along the way. But of course, because I had metastatic cancer, I was willing to do whatever without really, thinking about it. But I do get the frustration part. So here's how I think of it anyways. I think of it as a very almost circular type of thing, and what we as patients require in order to get better treatment, to deal with a disease, and in many cases it's life-threatening disease, and how can we do a better job at that? And start to take it apart very slowly and say, okay, what do I need to better understand my treatment? What can I do to improve my situation? What questions can I ask my physician when I'm about to undergo treatment? For example, today there are neoadjuvant trials that you may not want to start the regular standard treatment. You may want to participate in a trial at an earlier stage, not as a last recourse, but really in terms of some of these trials we've seen in neoadjuvant treatment, meaning before you have surgery, and then you have the surgery, and then you have the adjuvant treatment. And this may be for earlier stage patients, not just stage 4 patients, but stage 3 patients. So really, it's that engagement, that early engagement in the process. And once you see it from the patient perspective, all right, I want to get the best treatment, and perhaps I want to participate in a clinical trial. So now, how do we ideate that trial? How do we make a better trial? How can we be more engaged and make it more patient-centric? And then ultimately, if the trial, as the trial goes on, to better understand the preferences and the of the patient throughout the trial, and bring that back to the decision makers, those who decide to either approve at the regulatory stage or to reimburse the drug. And of course, along that route, who are we informing? We're informing our physicians, our researchers, the industry sponsors, the academia, and so forth, and ultimately our health policy as we go along through this process. So if you think of it as really sort of a circular approach in the treatment cycle for a patient until hopefully they become survivors from a successful treatment. This will really sort of, allow us to take it apart. We cannot do everything. We certainly cannot do everything ourselves, nor do we think we can do everything ourselves. But we can help to bring those people together who make these decisions, to do these things. So essentially, we're collaborators, just like your collab, right? So we're bringing people together to make better decisions to improve outcomes for our patients as they go through it. And try not to get frustrated. Try to break it apart and improve each stage, because everything that every individual does or every step that we take improves the process, and ultimately, that's the goal.
So is that how you would measure success then?
I measure success very simply. Is it a treatment that meets the needs of patients, uh, um, uh, throughout the process? I think that's an easy way of defining success from a patient-centered approach to clinical trials. If it's not meeting the needs of patients, then likely it's not going to be, or it is not a successful trial. We can only provide the input to to make it a better trial, and then of course, not every drug is going to be successful. Unfortunately, not every trial is going to be successful. But if we can increase the amount of trials and have better trials in Canada, I think we increase or improve the output from these trials for the betterment of patients.
Two final questions. So if I'm giving you the floor on any final thoughts on patient-centric approach to clinical trials, and then as Colorectal Cancer Canada, what are the most pressing issues you're dealing with, and what do you see as areas that need more focus?
Wow. Okay, I could talk for another few hours on that last one. I think one of the things that we have to accomplish is to get more people involved, right, from each of the target areas that we think are important, and that really does include the patient groups. We really need more patient groups to become engaged in this process. And it took a while, even for us at Colorectal Cancer Canada, to focus in this particular area, because it really is, obviously it's very important as we develop new trials, but it doesn't sort of respond to the sort of normal traditional role of patient groups, which tend to be awareness and education, support for the patients and their families, and advocacy on their behalf. That's pretty much what patient groups do. In this case, we really are focused on the landscape of new medications coming down, precision medicine patient treatments coming down the pipeline, how we can get access to it, and how we prioritize that at colorectal cancer is to say, all right, how are patients going to get access to these things? We know we need to engage in finding those right patients who will benefit from the drugs for these precision medicines. So I sit on the board of FT3, or from testing to targeted treatments, on a global situation. In Canada, we developed our Get Personal program on molecular profiling and work with other partners in North America and in Canada on our Beat Cancer Coalition in order to bring the parties together to collaborate, as I said, into developing the value story for molecular profiling or biomarker testing, increasing access, and work with partners. We just worked with a pharmaceutical partner and a comprehensive genome and next generation sequencing partner, if you will, in order to put together a pilot project for access to molecular profiling in non-academic community centers, and offered a $300,000 grant, and that was well publicized, and we hope to replicate that. So not only developing ideas, but actually putting them into practice was very important for us. And that's just the first stage. So that's on molecular profiling. When we talk about our healthcare system in Canada, how can we gain further access to it when we know that there's only going to be phase 2 trials in many instances? So how do we work with Cathy Ness, our trial sponsors, and manufacturers, or academia and researchers, in order to reduce it, or accelerate access and reduce the time to patient? So not only looking at getting those drugs approved early on, perhaps now through the time-limited reimbursement program that Cathy is initiating, but how can we work together in order to not only increase access, bring this trial information, bring the patient preference information, and so forth earlier on, in order to reduce what we call the time to patient. So that's in the next phase of it. So that, if, as I said, you take it apart, from the need, do that needs assessment, to how do we get access to some of the new precision medicines, doing the profiling for it, determine what the value story is for the patient, making sure it meets their needs, and then looking at other aspects, for example, the psychosocial needs of the patients and so forth, but really seeing it as a continuum. There's survivorship programs is another thing, or perhaps end of life, as it may be. So there's so many aspects to look at it from the priority, but we start from the basis. What is important to the patient and their family, of course, and caregivers, and how do we do everything possible to meet their needs along the way? And I just gave you a few examples in terms of access to drugs, but there's so many other things that go along that continuum. So our priority in terms of access to clinical trials is the need to screen people, to better inform people, to make sure they can participate in trials, and to ensure that there are as many trials as possible in Canada, and that the investment in research is done throughout the country, and that our health policy isn't such that it drives clinical trials away, and creating a more fertile ground for these trials in Canada.
Yeah, that's really important. So we probably could have gone on for a lot longer, but I do want to reiterate your call to action for patient groups to be more engaged in the patient-centric approach to clinical trials. And with that, thank you, Barry, for shedding light on patient centricity in clinical trials. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, share, and stay tuned for more conversations. Until next time, I'm Sabrina Hanna signing off. Thank you, Barry.
Oh, thanks. It's a pleasure to do it. It was fun.